Hi there, hi. Can you hear me? Brilliant. Okay. I'll just put on my presentation and then we'll get going. Right then. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you to Kath for introducing me and helping me out today and looking at the chat and everything. Today I'm going to tell you the unlikely story of a political great escape, how one of the great political characters of interwar Britain managed to save his country, his career, and his bank balance from what seemed like certain doom. So first, who am I talking about? Who was J.H. Thomas? Well, he was one of the most well-known political figures of his day, yet today he's pretty much forgotten. I've put on there a second bullet point, working class background. It's something of an understatement. Jimmy, as he was known, was born in the industrial town of Newport, South Wales, at the height of the Industrial Revolution in the 1870s, and raised in abject poverty. He was the illegitimate son of a servant girl, but he was actually raised by his grandmother, a widowed washerwoman who had lost her husband at sea. The woman Thomas knew as his older sister was in fact his mother, but once he found out, she refused to see him. He was working by the age of 9, and at 15 he began his career on the railways as an engine cleaner. But Jimmy Thomas wasn't destined to be a railwayman all his life. As you can see from the quote on the left from his autobiography, he was passionate about working class representation and emancipation. He believed that no matter, what someone's background was, they should have the chance to make a difference to the world, to achieve their aspirations. And let me tell you, Jimmy certainly did do that. He quickly became involved in trade unionism, which was emerging at that time. And he was a very talented public speaker. He was an able organizer, and he was appointed president of his union before the age of 40. Thomas played a key role in uniting the various railway organizations into the National Union of Railwaymen, NUR, which soon became one of Britain's most powerful trade unions, owing to the importance of the railways to the economy of that era. He was made General Secretary of the NUR in 1916 and successfully led them through the 1919 National Rail Strike. So I think it would be fair to say that by about 1920, he was probably Britain's leading trade unionist. And that also meant that he was a leading figure in the new Labour Party, that had been founded in the year 1900. At that time, the Labour Party was displacing the Liberals as the party of the British left in what is still to this day essentially a two-party system. And Thomas was elected as the Member of Parliament for Derby in 1910. Derby was a railwomen's stronghold, and he also soon established himself with a reputation as an effective parliamentarian as well. This all meant that during the 1920s, when Labour was dominated by a so-called Big Five leading personalities, Thomas was arguably the best known and most popular of those men, with the exception of the party's leader, Ramsay MacDonald. But Thomas's undoubted ability was probably overshadowed then and, to this day by people who've studied him by the fact that he was one of the, he was what might be called like a political character. I kind of feel like over the last few years, we've had a few of these politicians emerge who essentially what they do is they play a larger than life character. And Jim Thomas was very much in that mold. Thomas's character was the typical working man of his age. He was a drinker, a gambler, a lover of sport. He said it as it is. He spoke with an exaggerated working class accent. He never said the letter H. He might have exaggerated the accent. He definitely didn't exaggerate the drinking. Following the last talk, I was tempted to try and reenact this on live stage, but I think probably best not. He used to, for lunch, drink a martini, a pint of beer, and a glass of brandy. And that was when his friend said he started to be cutting down. This character that he played had undoubted cross-class appeal, and also his talent for telling anecdotes and jokes made him very popular as an after-dinner speaker in establishment circles. His penchant for wining and dining with the great and good saw him caricatured, as you can see on the right, as the Right Honourable dress suit. At the time, it was considered comic for a man as common as Jimmy to be dressing up like an aristocrat. But his appeal was further broadened by the fact he was an unashamed moderate or centrist. He was very unequivocally patriotic, a champion of the British Constitution, which he said allowed the engine cleaner of yesterday, him obviously, to become the minister of today. Probably one of the most extraordinary things about Thomas's rise was that during the 1920s, he became a genuine close personal friend of King George V, the monarch who was ruling 25% of the globe. Thomas and his wife regularly holidayed with the royals at Balmoral in Scotland, which Thomas had the temerity to tell the king was a bloody dull house. As you can see from this little gif here, here's a Buckingham Palace garden party, and King George adored spending time with JH, as he affectionately called him. In fact, Thomas once told him a joke, I believe that was rather unsavory, but a joke that was so funny that the king had to be hospitalized. He laughed so hard, he ripped open an old operation scar. Anyway, all of that meant that by the end of the 20s, 1929, Thomas is really at the peak of his powers. He is, considered a future leader of the party, of the Labour Party, and Labour in 1929 returned to office, returned to power. So it seemed like his best years were surely ahead of him. So what went wrong? What went wrong for JH? Why did he need a great escape? Well, the first problem came when Labour actually returned to office in the summer of 1929. The party had promised to tackle unemployment, which, unlike in the US, for example, had remained persistently high throughout the 20s. Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald gave Thomas the largely ceremonial post of Lord Privy Seal, and he tasked him with tackling unemployment, which stood at around 1.2 million. However, as I'm sure many of you know, just a few months later, the Wall Street crash hit, and the world was plunged into the Great Depression. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we can hardly blame Thomas for the fact that unemployment rates rose in the first few months of the Great Depression. But as you can see here, he was ridiculed in the press for his failure as the number of jobless spiraled out of control. Here we see Thomas attempting to use his repertoire of jokes to solve the problem. While in this cartoon, we see Jimmy the coach failing to make any difference, despite everything he tries, to the unemployment problem. Now, one of the ministers actually in the government aided with with aiding Thomas, helping him, was a guy called Oswald Mosley, future leader of the British fascist movement, back then a Labour Party rising star. But Thomas rejected Mosley's more radical proposals. It's a bit of a moot point, but probably historians today think they wouldn't have made much difference anyway. But Mosley resigned, and he made a big fuss about it. And this cartoon shows him joining the dole queue of jobless, an extra one on the unemployment figure, as Jimmy looks on from the window, helpless. So by 1930, June, midway through the year, he'd been in post about a year, and unemployment had almost doubled to 2 million. And his reputation was severely damaged. He'd come across as incompetent, and he was really a lightning rod for frustration with the government. As a result, probably to the relief of everyone, Jimmy was shifted to the post of Dominion Secretary. Still a cabinet post, but a rather inconsequential one. The Dominion's office was responsible for managing relations with Britain's self-governing dominions, Ireland, Canada, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. But holding a backroom job like that meant Thomas had very little prospect of rebuilding his reputation in the Labour movement, and he humiliatingly lost his seat on the party's executive. He also managed to alienate the Canadian Prime Minister at the 1930 Imperial Conference by calling the Canadians' proposals humbug, and the conference really didn't achieve very much. Again, slight caveat, the fact that Thomas basically couldn't offer anything because he had no control over British economic policy, but the fact that things are not going well, the fact that the Great Depression means his trade union career probably isn't going to result in any more great victories, wages are only going one way, means that his career prospects have been more or less trashed. And it wasn't just his career prospects that were in trouble. As we know by now, Jimmy liked to live the good life. As you can see, joke on the slide there, apparently he used to drink 9 gallons of champagne a year. He liked to golf, he liked to fish, he liked to smoke cigars, he liked to gamble. But he didn't just bet on the horses. He was a noted stock market speculator. He was once considered inappropriate for the job of Chancellor, managing the government's money, because he would use that information for stock market speculation. In kind of late 1929, Thomas had what might be described as a kind of nervous collapse, to the extent his friend the King wrote to him to make sure he's okay. Now, traditionally, this has been associated with his failure to deal with unemployment, but actually it may also have been due to the fact that the Wall Street crash had a devastating effect on his personal finances because of his stock market gambling. Within a few years, he was definitely tens of thousands of pounds in debt. We don't know an exact figure, rumor, that sort of thing. But considering his ministerial salary was only £5,000 a year, that's a pretty astronomical sum. And that ministerial salary, the only hope of financial stability he had, was itself under threat. Because in August 1931, Britain was engulfed in a financial crisis that brought the Labour government that he was a part of to its knees. There was a run on the pound, and it looked like Britain's whole economic system was on the brink of collapse. The government's creditors demanded cuts in spending and a 10% cut in unemployment benefit. The Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, pictured on the left, thought the cuts were necessary because a collapse in the pound would do more damage to the poor than austerity. But the cabinet wasn't quite so sure. It split badly, 11-9 in favour. Now, Thomas stuck by his boss, and the two of them, realising their days were probably numbered, agreed what amounted to a kind of political suicide pact. They decided that should the Labour government collapse and they had to leave office, they would become independents, so that they would be able to defy party discipline and vote for the economy package they believed was necessary. So, JH's hopes of becoming Labour leader have evaporated. He's deeply in debt. He looks like he's about to lose his salary, the only thing that's keeping his head above water. And the nation also, by the way, also happens to be on the brink of disaster. So, how is Jimmy going to pull off a great escape? Well, let me tell you. First of all, when Labour left office on the 24th of August, 1931, Jimmy and MacDonald didn't. They remained. Instead of resigning and becoming independents, at the behest of the King, an emergency unity government, known as the National Government, was formed with leading figures from all parties, and MacDonald remaining Prime Minister. Thomas also remained as Dominion Secretary, so for now he'd saved his ministerial salary, and perhaps this unity government would save the country. Alas, no, the sterling crisis got worse. Britain was forced off the gold standard in September, and things had gone from bad to worse. So the Conservative members of this unity government of all parties began to agitate for a general election. They demanded that rather than the short-lived temporary emergency solution, the national government should go out and win a mandate from the country to remain in office for long term, basically stick it out till the economy's fixed. Now, Thomas, on both patriotic and, of course, personal reasons, was absolutely in favour of the national government remaining in the long term, and, of course, him within it. So the National Alliance basically decided to go to the country to call an election and take on the Labour Party, which had decided to oppose the national government. And they'd expelled the likes of MacDonald and Thomas. Not only that, but Thomas's union had sacked him for joining the national government. So it was a straight up fight between this new National Alliance, including Thomas, and the Labour movement, which Thomas had spent his whole life as a part of. And the jeopardy wasn't over yet, because Thomas's own seat, parliamentary seat, Derby, I've told you already, was a Labour and railway stronghold. So he could yet lose his seat and lose everything. Shall we see Jimmy in action in the Battle for Derby? I think we should. I'm in control, so yes, we are going to. I'm just going to show you a little clip from a newsreel of Thomas fighting the fight in Derby. You can kind of put this full screen, I believe, because it'll look a bit small, I'm sure, for you. As you can see, it wasn't an easy ride. You know, quite a lot of heckling, but he'd been used to that over his career. And he also spoke on the newsreels directly addressing the electors, basically accusing his old Labour colleagues of running away from the crisis. And he's saying, no, I'm standing by the nation. So, well, I've given away the ending because it's called A Political Great Escape. But does Jimmy escape? Yes, he does. He escapes and he wins big. He won Derby by an absolute landslide. It had been a Labour stronghold and Labour was wiped out. The kind of combined appeal, I suppose, of Labour, Conservative and Liberal figures all campaigning united against just what was left of the Labour Party on its own meant that, you know, most electors saw there was only one choice to save the country. And as you can see on the right, the National Alliance won the biggest victory in British history. 554 seats to the Labour Party's 52. So Jimmy had done it. He backed the winning horse and he pulled off a political great escape. He was key in creating and securing the national government, which he would say, you know, open to interpretation, of course, but which he would argue had saved the country. It saved the pound, stabilized the currency, stabilized the economy, and actually oversaw a remarkably rapid recovery in Britain from the Great Depression. The painful cuts, which were so debated in 1931, were all restored and undone by 1934. He undoubtedly had saved his career. He'd gone from being tarnished by unemployment in a dead end, without a future, looking at the prospect of even sitting as an independent or losing his seat in Derby, to now being what was called one of the big six of the national government, the sole representative of the working classes in a supposedly cross-class unity cabinet. And he had, of course, saved his bank balance. Not only had he preserved his ministerial salary, but by remaining at the top of British politics, at the heart of political power, he could use his contacts and his knowledge to basically carry out insider dealing on the stock market and leak vital information for profit to vital extra revenue streams for his beleaguered finances, which, you know, it's a story for another day where that ends up. I will leave you with a quote from Thomas's police bodyguard, who would also coincidentally serve Winston Churchill in the same role. He said that he was always support Thomas, so long as he remains ashore, because Thomas nearly drowned his bodyguard when they went too far out to sea on a fishing boat. Again, another story for another time. But anyway, the bodyguard said, he has his faults, but the man who rises unaided from engine cleaner to cabinet minister to be the friend of kings, yet keeps the common touch, is a big man. There are many worse epitaphs than that. Thank you very much. Sure. That's a good question. Basically, because you can read as much as you like about Jimmy Thomas, and there's always a new hilarious story, basically, about him. Um, and I just think the whole aesthetic of going from the background that he had, that I started the presentation with, to literally going every summer to stay with the king because his king was his best mate. It beggars belief. It almost feels like, as much as obviously, we're talking 100 years later, it almost feels like that it just wouldn't be possible now. That almost, the division between someone at the bottom of society and literal royalty is almost unassailable compared to then, when somehow he was able just to kind of get on with people from all classes. I don't know. That's a really good question. I'd say, a very controversial point, because um, what I Thomas is one of the reasons he's forgotten is because he's basically seen as a traitor. He spent his whole life serving the labor movement, trade unions, the party, and yet when it came to a crisis, he didn't stick with them. He jumped ships and backed the national government, and basically became a kind of creature of the system. As to whether the national government saved the country, which actually was the question that I should be answering, there's no doubt that Britain did much better in the Great Depression than almost any of its neighbours and comparable countries, and it recovered much quicker than, say, the United States. By about 34, 35, it was actually more or less enjoying certainly a housing boom and a boom in many industries. It's probably quite regional. Some regions, northeast of England, Wales, Clydeside, which had old traditional heavy industry, remained depressed for much longer, whereas the Midlands and South, with newer industries like car manufacturing, radio, did really well in the 30s. How much of all of that is down to the national government is also really hard to say, because certainly it restored confidence in the financial markets. And again, from the point of view, if you were, on the left of the political spectrum, you might say, well, what does that matter? But it probably did affect business confidence and investment. So it's kind of a question that I can't answer in one go. And he would say he did, and many of his former colleagues would say absolutely not. But that's kind of politics, isn't it? Sure. Okay, well, his bodyguard, a guy called Walter H. Thompson, they were on holiday in Brighton. Well, Thomas was on holiday. Obviously, the bodyguard had to go with him. Actually, part of other funny anecdote is the fact that he got a bodyguard. It wasn't normal for ministers to necessarily have bodyguards then. He got given a police bodyguard because he was, as Dominion Secretary, dealing with the Irish, and it was considered possible that Irish extremists might want to assassinate him. His response was to tell Walter Thompson that it was a waste of money for him to be around. So the guy who's following you around all day, having to basically live your life with you, just to be told you're wasting your time. But anyway, they were in holiday, the Thomases, in Brighton in 1933, and he decided to go out on a little boat fishing. It had a little motor, and he wasn't catching anything, so he kept asking to go further and further out to sea, to Thomas. And eventually, the weather turned, and the sea was quite rough, and it was just a tiny little boat, and the engine failed. And they were basically, it was nightfall was coming in, it was getting dark, and apparently Thomas, well, the words Walter Thompson uses is that he used very colourful language. to describe the situation. They tried to row back, but they didn't get anywhere, and miraculously they were picked up by a passing ship. But yeah, so that comes from that quote at the end that I said, where Thompson said that he would always support Thomas so long as he remained ashore. Clearly that incident had scarred him to some extent. That's a really good one. On History's Most, we always try to have both superlatives, totally unnecessarily, by the way, but we just like to have superlatives, but to cover stories that aren't that well known. We always try and do topics that people wouldn't just be able to kind of reel off the top of their head. So, we've mostly avoided, for example, the Second World War. I can see someone in the chat, Bob, telling me it's the 1930s. Maybe. One thing I would say is that on the podcast, we have done quite a few people or time periods that maybe haven't got the attention that probably they merit in terms of their effect on world history. We talked to Robin Pearson of the History of Byzantium about the Byzantine Empire. That's not exactly a period because it lasts 1,000 years, but it's probably for its historical significance massively overlooked. If you were to study medieval history, you could probably never really come across Byzantium. I would say also one figure we've talked about multiple times on the podcast is Eric Ludendorff, who is massively overlooked in terms of the effects he's had on history. He basically was responsible for a large part for Germany losing the First World War and for the Russian Revolution, because he transported Lenin to Russia to destabilize it, and then for patronizing with both money, attention, and prestige Adolf Hitler in the early 1920s. And yet, probably, again, a lot of people haven't heard of him, pretty peripheral figure in a lot of histories of, say, the rise of the Nazis or things like that. So, I mean, I can't also, I know this answer's taken forever, but I can't also fail to mention the Spanish Civil War, which is one of my specialisms, in which I'm doing a panel on straight after this talk. So I've got to plug it in here now on stage one. I've written about it, but it's a fascinating, multifaceted conflict, and it's something that, again, most people just don't really know anything about, and it's kind of a footnote next to the Second World War of things like the build up to war, when actually it's in its own right, it's a massive and really unique event, if you see what I mean. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it is a fair statement. I think there's a few reasons for that. First of all, it's not got any big shiny thing like the New Deal of being this policy that's easily packaged up as, oh, the New Deal, they built loads of stuff, they built electricity cable dams and whatever, and put people back to work. So there isn't any single thing like that that you can put your finger on and be like, oh, well, that was good. Secondly, I think there's very much a kind of cultural and history writing as well, historical kind of consensus that emerged in the 30s and in the decades immediately afterwards, that the 1930s in Britain had been the devil's decade. It had been a terrible time of mass unemployment, of certain regions being left behind, and that could never happen again. So you just have to think about George Orwell's book, The Road to Wigan Pier. Lots of other intellectuals kind of wrote stuff about during the 1930s that painted it as a really kind of dark time. And the national government also gets a very bad press because ultimately more focus goes to it, because it carried on till 1940, and more attention goes to appeasement, which obviously wasn't a successful policy. At least that's the mainstream interpretation. And because what came afterwards, after the Second World War, well, first of all, after the national government, you had Winston Churchill, who was considered a great, obviously, despite recent controversies. I think still considered a major figure in British history. So the people who came before Churchill are going to be, less significant or less celebrated. And actually, after the Second World War, you had the Labour government of Clement Attlee, which did a whole load of social programs, not least the National Health Service, which again gets loads of attention and seen as something fantastic. So they were setting out to fix what they had seen as the problem with the 30s. So if you think, that Labour government was a success, which pretty much everyone does, and probably right, and absolutely rightly so, then you've kind of got to think the things before it were a failure. So I think probably it's just been a bit unfashionable to look at the national government and look at Britain's response to the Great Depression. I mean, I think there's only one book specifically about the national government even today by a guy called Nick Smart. Obviously, there's lots of histories of the 30s and things like that, but yeah, it's remained very much neglected. Probably more takeaways of what not to do. He was definitely a functioning alcoholic, and that probably is not something that you would recommend. Yeah, and probably it might be worth bringing in here how it all ended badly wrong. He basically got in a situation he couldn't escape from, which is after about 5 years later, after the story I told today, in 1936, he came a cropper basically because of what I mentioned right at the end, a bit of insider dealing and leaking of information. So he leaked budget secrets that had been discussed at cabinet to basically friends who were stock market speculators. There is a story, I don't know whether it's apocryphal, but again, there's lots of stories about Thomas, that the way he leaked it was he was playing golf with these people, because of course he was, and he was giving hints as to what taxes would be raised or cut, or what policy put in place, by doing things like hitting a golf shot from the tee and shouting "tee up," as in tea duties are going to rise. So then people would bet on the stock market against the tea companies. So yeah, he basically had to resign as a minister and an MP, and in 1936 he never made a comeback. At a pretty sad end, to be honest, because even in like 1940, in the Second World War, he was writing to the government saying, "Look, I'll help any way I can. If you need anyone to do anything, I'll come in." But no one wanted him after that. Golf, alcohol, and money is probably best to steer clear of. No, that's a really good question. Wow. We have managed to flog a dead horse about Eric Ludendorff many times. And we kind of have a love-hate relationship with him on History's Most. We recently, our most recent kind of series, because we sometimes do series on particular topics, was about the Weimar Republic, and trying to get beyond like I say, we try and look at neglected stuff in history, so trying to get beyond the dominant narrative of just inevitable Nazi rise, hyperinflation, and that being about it, and just getting to the heart of the political life of the Weimar Republic. And I really, really enjoyed doing that. It was alongside, I kind of did it alongside work, putting the finishing touches to a book I've written about Weimar political history. So that's been a real kind of labor of love over recent times for me. So yeah. Sure. I mean, as I think some very kind people have put in the chat, I have kind of written before about the Spanish Civil War, and people seem to like my books about the Spanish Civil War. So maybe if you like me, or you like the panel that's coming next, you know, then that might be recommended. But on Weimar, it's coming out in November. It's called Hindenburg, Ludendorff, and Hitler: Germany's Generals and the Rise of the Nazis. And actually, one day I hope to write something about Jimmy Thomas, because there's just so much to write about. Oh, that's really nice. That's lovely. I'm just scrolling. I mean, if you've got a minute, I could share another video of Thomas if you want. All right then. I think I think it's about 50 seconds. So this is Thomas speaking to the nation in 1931 about why they should back him and the national government. I just love his accent. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope if people have enjoyed it, and they haven't done so already, check out the History's Most podcast. Thank you. Thanks so much. Bye.